My wife came back from a work trip acting distant and secretive. She suggested an open marriage, claiming it would reignite our connection. I later found out her therapist, an old friend, encouraged her to pursue excitement outside our marriage. Feeling utterly betrayed, I realized I couldn't continue living this lie. I still remember the day Carla came home from her work trip. Normally, her return would be filled with laughter and lively chatter about the people she met and the adventures she had. But that day, everything felt different. I watched her step through the door, and the energy I'd always known in her was replaced by a quiet reserve. When I asked about her trip, she offered only short, vague answers that left me more puzzled than reassured. As the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking at someone else entirely. The warmth and excitement that once lit up her face were nowhere to be seen, replaced by a distant, almost guarded expression. I tried to convince myself that she might simply be tired or overwhelmed by the busy pace of travel. Yet, deep down, I sensed that this return marked the beginning of something I couldn't yet name, a subtle shift in our lives that would soon unravel into a story far more complex than I ever imagined. That first night, as I lay awake wondering what had changed, I realized that sometimes the smallest details can hint at a much deeper transformation. At first I thought it was just the usual post-trip fatigue. It happens, right? But days passed and the distance between us didn't fade. It only grew. Something was off, and it wasn't just about being tired. The way she snapped at me, over the smallest things, things that would have never bothered her before, felt like a warning I couldn't ignore. We used to have this rhythm, Carla and I. We didn't have to try. It was easy to connect. But now, none of our conversations felt the same. The silence between us grew uncomfortable, and even when we spoke, I could sense an invisible wall building up. I'd suggest a walk or dinner to try and restore some normalcy, but she would cancel. Sometimes she said she was too tired. Other times she came up with excuses, work, errands, even the strangest things. The more I tried to be close, the further she pulled away. I knew something was wrong, but when I asked, she just brushed it off. "It's nothing, I just need space," she'd say, but I couldn't help but wonder, space from what? From me? And it wasn't just the cancelled dates. She started spending more time alone, locking herself in her room, losing herself in her phone, not engaging with me. I felt like I was fighting for her attention while she was slipping further into this version of herself that I barely recognized. Every night I'd lie next to her, and somehow it felt like I was more alone than ever. I began to ask myself what had changed. What was causing this growing chasm between us? Was it me? Was it her? But I couldn't find a clear answer. All I knew was that every day the space between us became harder to ignore, until it felt like we were living in separate worlds. A world that once felt so familiar, but now everything felt distant and uncertain. Days turned into weeks, and the gap between us grew more noticeable. I'd wake up to silence at breakfast, a quiet that replaced the easy banter we once shared. Our routine, once full of mutual understanding, began to crumble. Simple plans, like our weekly walks or coffee dates, slowly disappeared as Carla started cancelling them with vague reasons. I tried to reach out to ask if everything was okay, but her responses were short and distant, leaving me with a heavy sense of isolation. The small disagreements that would have once brought a smile now turned into heated exchanges. Every minor comment felt like a trigger, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was somehow to blame. I found myself questioning if I had missed something, a sign that this growing distance was more than just a phase. At night, the quiet of our home pressed in on me, and I realized that I was living with a stranger, someone whose eyes no longer met mine with the warmth they once did. I struggled to understand where we had gone wrong, feeling increasingly alone. In a marriage that once meant everything, each passing day deepened my worry, and I couldn't shake the thought that the love we built was slipping further away, lost in the silence between us. I reached a point where I needed help. Our growing distance pushed me to suggest we try marriage counseling, hoping that a neutral voice could help us bridge the gap. To my surprise, Carla refused to join me in therapy. She said she needed to work on herself first and insisted on finding a therapist on her own. Though it wasn't what I expected, I agreed. I just wanted her to find some clarity and perhaps help us reconnect. Soon enough, she started meeting with her therapist regularly, 3 times a week for long sessions. At first, I noticed a slight change in her mood after these meetings. She seemed lighter, as if some of the weight on her shoulders had lifted. I clung to that hope, believing that these sessions would be the turning point for our relationship. But as days passed, the changes grew more unsettling. Carla began spending more time away from home, making plans without including me, and slowly retreating further into her own world. What I had hoped would be a path back to us seemed instead to deepen the divide. It all came crashing down when the secrets began to surface. I started hearing whispers from friends, small remarks about seeing Carla at bars, laughing with strangers, and behaving in ways that didn't match the woman I once knew. The vague excuses no longer sufficed, and each new piece of information deepened the mystery surrounding her sudden change. Then, in one conversation that still haunts me, she calmly proposed something I never expected. Without raising her voice or showing any remorse, she suggested that perhaps an open marriage was the key to reigniting a spark that had long faded. According to her, this new arrangement would allow us both to rediscover parts of ourselves we'd buried over time. Her words, delivered in an almost detached manner, cut through me. It wasn't just the secret nights out or the casual encounters that unsettled me. It was the idea that our bond could be so easily rewritten, as if the love we built was something disposable. In that moment, I felt as though our entire history was being questioned. The trust we once shared was shattered by a proposal that seemed more like an escape than a solution. I was left grappling with a painful truth. The secrets that had been hidden for so long were now laying bare a future that neither of us had ever planned for. I reached a moment where I had no choice but to confront the truth head-on. One evening, after yet another long day of silence, punctuated only by fleeting excuses, I asked Carla about everything: the secret nights out, the strange calls, and the unsettling proposal of an open marriage. I remember her eyes narrowing as she listened, and for the first time I saw a spark of defiance behind them. The conversation escalated quickly. I laid out everything I had heard from our friends, every whisper that painted a picture so different from the woman I once knew. Instead of offering clarity, Carla shifted the blame onto me. She accused me of being controlling, of choking her spirit and keeping her locked in a life that no longer suited her. Her words were sharp and cold, and as she spoke, I felt the weight of our shared past crumble beneath us. Every attempt I made to reconnect was met with more distance. The more I pressed, the more defensive she became, until the discussion turned into a heated exchange where neither of us truly listened. In that moment, as our voices rose and our hearts pounded with raw emotion, I realized that we had reached a point of no return. The person I had loved was slipping away behind a wall of anger and deflection, leaving behind only fragments of a life we once cherished. That confrontation, raw and painful, marked the breaking point. I understood then that holding on to what we had would only lead to more heartache. The truth was clear. Our marriage had become a battleground, and I could no longer fight a war that was eroding us both. The truth finally came to light in a way I never thought possible. It wasn't through an open conversation between us, or some deep revelation in therapy. It came from a source I never expected. One day, Carla admitted that the one person she had confided in throughout all of this wasn't just a therapist. It was an old friend of hers, someone she had reconnected with, someone who had become far more involved than I could have ever imagined. Her name was Elle, and it turned out Elle wasn't just offering advice. She was convincing Carla that change, big change, was essential. Elle had gotten into Carla's head in ways I couldn't fully grasp. Over the course of months, she'd undermined everything I thought I knew about our marriage. Elle told Carla she deserved more than what she had: more freedom, more excitement, more validation. Elle painted a picture of a life outside the boundaries we had set in our relationship, one void of limitations or commitment. Apparently, it was Elle who first suggested that Carla was living a life that wasn't fulfilling. According to Elle, she hadn't realized how oppressed she was in our marriage, doing everything right, fulfilling all expectations, yet it was never enough. Elle had convinced her that what she really needed was to reconnect with the wild version of herself, the version that dated multiple men, that felt unrestricted, never weighed down by the commitments of marriage, responsibility, or the compromises life required. I had no idea that while I was trying to hold on, trying to save us, Carla was being told by Elle that everything between us was wrong. And that trip, the one I thought would be just another week away for work, was the turning point. She met someone, a co-worker, someone who would whisper into her ear that she deserved to have it all, which, at some point, meant betraying our vows. When Carla came home, she was distant. She told me nothing, yet I could feel the weight of the secret she was carrying. I didn't know how to respond, couldn't understand what was going on because everything I thought I knew about Carla had been altered, manipulated. I remember questioning if this was a real transformation or if it was all part of something bigger, something darker than I understood. Then, when I finally confronted her about the betrayal, the shock wasn't just the affair or the proposal for an open marriage. It was that Carla had been secretly validating her actions with someone else's guidance, a person who didn't care about our marriage, who didn't mind if it crumbled just to see Carla's happiness unfold. And just like that, the betrayal wasn't just about the affair. It was about everything that had been quietly influencing Carla for months. Her decisions weren't her own anymore. They were shaped, twisted by someone else, and that revelation hit harder than anything I had ever expected. Everything was different now. Our marriage, her betrayal, and even the truth behind it all. I wasn't just dealing with a partner who was lost in herself. I was now facing the reality that I had been played. I reached a point where silence was no longer an option. One night, I finally asked Carla to lay it all out. No more half-truths or vague excuses. With a resigned sigh, she told me that about a year ago she reconnected with an old high school friend named Elle. She explained that he gradually became a regular part of her life, always questioning the way things were between us. According to her, Elle made her see that I was too set in my ways, and that I was holding her back from exploring a more fulfilling version of herself. Listening to her, I felt a mix of shock and betrayal. It wasn't just that she had let someone, it was that she had allowed his ideas to reshape her view of our marriage. In her calm admission, it became clear that her trust in Elle had eroded the foundation of what we once shared. I sat there grappling with the realization that the life I thought I knew was slipping away, replaced by choices that I had no part in making. The truth hit me hard. Our marriage was being dismantled by secrets and influences I never saw coming. It was after that conversation that I knew it was over. Carla had finally revealed everything, but it offered nothing to salvage. Her strings had been pulled by this outside influence, her own dissatisfaction left unaddressed, and her actions laid bare for all to see. I'd done my best to stick by her, to be patient, but as the days turned into weeks, the reality sank in. She was no longer the woman I'd married, and I could no longer pretend that this mess could be fixed. The next decision was the hardest. I had to choose whether to walk away or keep fighting for something that had ceased to exist. I couldn't live with this version of Carla, the one who had been pushed and pulled by ideas that didn't align with what we had. I couldn't accept her rejection of everything we'd built, all while expecting me to adapt to her changing wants, as if my own feelings didn't matter. So I made the hardest choice of my life. I asked for a divorce. At first, she didn't understand. She tried to convince me to change my mind. She cried, she begged, and in some twisted way she tried to manipulate me back into her grasp. But I stood firm. I knew it wasn't the marriage I entered into anymore. The late-night fights, the cold silence, the betrayal. It drained enough of me to know I couldn't do this anymore. And then she left, with all the drama and messy outbursts. It was chaotic, ugly, and the weight of it still lingers even as time passes. But what choice did I have? When you're not loved in the way you deserve, when the partnership you believed in is shattered, can you keep going? Now I ask you, what would you do in my place? Would you have fought harder or let go sooner? When do you draw the line between giving a relationship a second chance and accepting that it's finally over? I finally reached a moment where silence was no longer enough. I told Carla that this had to end. Our past was too tangled with secrets and betrayals to mend. In one quiet conversation, I explained that I was filing for divorce. I asked her to pack her belongings and leave our home. The decision felt heavy and inevitable, as if every unspoken word and hidden truth had led to that final moment. In the aftermath, the house seemed to echo with memories of a life we once shared. I sorted through the remnants of our time together, both the good and the painful. With each passing day, I faced the reality that the woman I once knew was now just a shadow of what we had become. The process of moving on was filled with mixed emotions, regret for what was lost and a resolve to reclaim my own path. Now, I find myself at a crossroads, questioning everything I once believed about love and commitment. If you were in my place, what would you do?